Today, I have the true honor of being able to introduce Dr. Alvin Roth, who's the Craig and Susan McGraw Professor of Economics here at Stanford University. And he's also the 2012 winner of the Nobel Prize in Economics. You may ask yourself, what the heck does an economist have to do with academic surgery? I'll give you two hints: kidney transplantation and surgical residency. So fortunately, we have an inside connection. Dr. Wapner and Dr. Greco are next door neighbors with Dr. Roth and Emily, his wife, and they've forged a friendship that has resulted in our ability to have him today speaking in front of us. And it also has led to some potential collaborative projects that we're working on. So Dr. Roth went to Columbia University School of Engineering, and then came out west to Stanford to get his PhD in the Department of Operations Management here and graduated in 1974. He went on to the University of Illinois, went up the ranks to full professor there, had a short stint, or 6-year stint at University of Pittsburgh, and then settled at Harvard for several years. Then in 2012, he came back to Stanford, at first as a visiting professor, and then formally joined the department in 2013. His academic work has been a study of how market design and matching theory can be used to match large groups of people with organizations and how they can select one another. It's been applied to everything from identifying your spouse, to matching kids into public schools, to the surgical, to the residency match, and to matching kidney donors with potential patients in paired exchanges. So in 2012, while he was a visiting professor here at Stanford, he was awarded the Nobel Prize for market design that has impacted almost everybody in the room. And of course, Harvard, Pittsburgh, and Stanford immediately took credit for him. So without much more ado, let's welcome Dr. Al Roth.
Thank you. So I'm going to try to talk to you today about two things that I don't normally talk about in the same talk, the resident match and kidney exchange. But I guess what those two things have in common, aside from me, is you. So maybe that'll make sense. But let me start by trying to amplify a little on why economists are interested in things like that. And to do that, I want to a little bit try to expand your idea of what a market is. And I think that most of us, when we think about markets, think about the New York Stock Exchange or the farmer's market. And let's think about the New York Stock Exchange for a minute. That's a market in which prices do all the work. You don't care who you're dealing with. When you want to buy shares on an exchange, you don't worry whether the person you're buying them from has taken good care of them, and the person who's selling them doesn't worry whether you'll take good care of them. But lots of markets don't work like that, and prices don't do all the work. For instance, Stanford Medical School doesn't raise tuition until just enough students want to come and study. It doesn't raise tuition until supply equals demand. Lots of people would like to study at Stanford Medical School, but you can't just come study, you have to be admitted. So there's other things going on than just prices. And in general universities, right, Stanford doesn't admit freshmen by raising the price until just enough students want to come to sit in the classrooms. And labor markets are like that too, you know, and college admissions and all of those things. They involve search on both sides, and you don't make offers to the whole market. When I want to buy shares in AT&T on the New York Stock Exchange, I make an offer to the whole market. I say I would like to buy shares at 100. And anyone who wants to sell me at that price can sell to me. But when you make an offer to a surgical fellow, you're not saying, we would like to have a surgical fellow, here are the wages and hours. You're making an offer to a particular person. So matching markets are markets where you can't just choose what you want, even if you can afford it. You could afford to attend Stanford Medical School, but you still can't come study here unless you're admitted. So you can't just choose what you want, you also have to be chosen. And that's the sense in which labor markets and other kinds of matching markets are a little bit like marriage. You can't just choose your spouse, you also have to be chosen. You can't just show up to work at Google or at Stanford, you have to be hired. So I'm going to talk to you today in that spirit about two marketplaces that I've been involved in. One set of markets are the matches in which medical residents and fellows get their first jobs as doctors, and I imagine that many of you have gone through those marketplaces, and the other one is kidney exchange. And again, what they have in common, aside from me and you, is that they're both matching markets. These are markets where prices don't do all the work. In the medical labor markets, you pay wages, so it may sometimes seem not, but you know, residents are paid, but it isn't the price that decides who gets what. It's a matching market that we'll talk about. And in kidney exchange, the laws are such that you can't pay for a kidney as such. And there's lots of costs that go into kidney transplantation, but you can't buy a kidney from the donor or from the family of the donor. So we don't let prices work at all in that market in deciding who gets what. But it still is it turns out transplantable organs are in very short supply compared to the demand. So there's a marketplace that has to allocate scarce resources and maybe do it in a way that will make them less scarce. So that's what I'm going to talk about for those. So let me start by telling you a little bit about the medical clearinghouses, and you all know, in many ways, you all know much more about that than I do. But the history of that market is internships as a first employment for doctors really began around 1900. And in those days, the standard way of looking for a job is you would get very near graduation in your fourth year of medical school, and shortly before you would look for what you were going to do in July and look for a job. And by around 1930, the standard time at which internship contracts were being signed was around New Year's in the fourth year of medical school. So it was a semester earlier than it had been at the turn of the last century. And when you looked at the medical journals that dealt with medical education, they would say, you know, we're going a little early, we're not finding out class standings, we're not finding out final semester results, let's not go any earlier than that. But of course, going early was one of the ways that residency programs competed with one another for good residents, and so encouraging people not to go earlier didn't stop them from going earlier. And by the 1940s, a customary time at which residents were being hired for their first jobs, that would begin after 4 years of medical school, was in the summer after their second year of medical school. So they were being hired 2 years in advance. And this is a process that I might talk a little more about, but it's not at all an unusual process in matching markets. If you know someone graduating from law school in June, and they're going to either an appellate court clerkship or to a job in a big law firm, they got that job 2 years ago in the summer after their first year of law school. Law school is a 3-year process. So they are somewhat like doctors were in the 1940s. They're getting their jobs very, very early compared to when they're graduating, and that means there's a lot of uncertainty that maybe doesn't have to be there in what kind of lawyer they're going to be, what kind of job they would like to have. The contracts are made far in advance. And indeed, we continue to see new fellowship matches formed because there are still subspecialties that don't use a match, and many of those are somewhat unraveled. So some years ago, I was involved in helping set up orthopedic surgery fellowship match, and they had been accustomed to hiring surgical residents in their second of 5 years, right? So they were hiring people 3 years in advance, and that caused them some problems. So that's a problem that the medical labor market has struggled with for some years. But in 1945, the medical schools intervened. So the medical schools are a third party. They're not the doctors and they're not the hospitals. They're not the residency programs. And they managed to control the date of appointment by embargoing release of information about medical students. So it's pretty risky to hire a future resident after his first year in medical school, but it's very risky to hire someone who says he's enrolled in medical school, but you can't get his transcript. So the medical schools were able to help the residency programs control the early date of appointment, and as they learned that they could control it, they moved the date of appointment back from the end of the second year to the middle of the third year to later in the fourth year where it is today. But they had other problems as they did it, and in particular, to not spend too much time on that, they had problems with exploding offers. You would get offers in the period when as soon as you were allowed to make offers, you'd get offers that would say, you'd answer the phone and say, Mark, this is Al, we want to make you an offer, and we'd require an answer before you hung up the phone, so we could talk about the job. You'd already interviewed with us. You knew about the job, but we'd learned from experience that if we let you think about it, then if you turned us down, all the people on our waiting list would have turned us down as well. So you would have the experience, if you were graduating in 1944, 45, of having to say yes or no to the first job that called you on the phone, even though you knew that if you hung up the phone, it might ring again with another offer. But you weren't sure, and you weren't sure what offers those would be. So once again, there was a lot of pressure to say yes or no before knowing what else was going to come. I should add that when appointments were unraveled, when they were being made in the summer after the first year, that was also the case. They weren't all made at one time. So you would get an offer, and maybe you'd have a week to respond, but that would be a week in which you still didn't know what future offers might come if you waited. Okay, so this caused a number of problems, and I won't go into them. Some of you might have some memory of that time. The match, sort of as we know it today, was developed in the 1950s. And what I mean by the match is the process of having a clearinghouse. So doctors go on interviews, instead of getting offers on the phone that are exploding offers, they submit rank order lists, fellowship directors, residency directors, and at a later point in the career, fellowship directors submit rank order lists, and something magical happens to those lists that culminates on match day when matches are announced. So I want to tell you a little bit about that process today. But it started off in the 1950s being very successful with very high rates of participation, and it only became less successful starting in the 70s. There was some decline from those very high rates of participation that had to do with the curious fact that in the 1950s, almost all graduates of American medical schools were men. But by 1970, about 10% of the graduates were women. Today, it's quite an equal ratio. And we started seeing people going on the resident match market as couples. And couples wanted two jobs and not one. And it turns out, and I'll tell you a little bit about how they tried to deal with this, it turns out that the couples weren't being well served by the match and weren't showing up on July 1st in the place where they'd been matched. They were getting on the phone and finding other ways to get jobs, and that was causing a ripple effect in not all the jobs that were made in the match were being consummated. Okay, so this actually came to a head in 1995 when I was asked to redesign the algorithm for the match, and I'll tell you a little bit about the subsequent development, but the algorithm that I designed, that I helped design, is used today that deals with some of the changes in the structure of the medical labor market that had taken place between 1950 and 1990s. Okay, so just to recap the history that I just told you, there was a period from 1900 to 1950 where the market was, 1940 something, where the market was unraveling. It was getting earlier and earlier, and so the point to an economist is that the market was getting less thick. You'd like to have all the workers and all the firms looking at each other at the same time and deciding where to go, where everyone can consider all their options. And what you were seeing instead was people were getting calls in the summer after their first year and having to decide without knowing what else was coming, and also without knowing what kind of doctor they wanted to be yet after 1 year of medical school. And then they had a period where they had uniform dates, but there was just too much stuff to do in too short a time. So so problems developed. Not all verbal agreements that were made on the phone in a hurry were honored. Sometimes poor agreements were made that had problems. And they transitioned to this centralized market clearing process, which with some modifications is still used. Now, all these arrows that you see, I've studied a lot of labor markets, and all these arrows, this kind of process has repeated itself and replicated itself in different kinds of markets, but not all of them have the same outcome. So all these arrows are transitions I've seen. And not every centralized market clearing procedure works. Sometimes the market reverts back to unraveling. That happens quite often. And It has to do with what is going on in the centralized clearinghouse, right? So right now, the centralized clearinghouse, I've offered it to you as a black box. Applicants and residency directors submit rank order lists, and something happens in this black box that suggests a match. But there's not a lot of compulsory power. It's been such a successful institution that it may seem to doctors that the match can make you go where you're supposed to go. But in fact, in years when people didn't want to go where they were supposed to go, they didn't go there. So the match depends on producing a good matching in order to work. So let me tell you about a bad matching algorithm so you can get some idea of what could go wrong. You get all these rank orders. So doctors go on interviews, they submit rank order lists, the residency programs submit rank order lists, and this was the first match algorithm that was proposed in 1950 for the match. It says we'll get all these rank order lists, and the first thing we'll do is we'll look at the people who ranked each other first, and we'll match them to each other. So if I'm a medical student and you're a residency director and you're my first choice and I'm your first choice, we're good. What could be simpler than that? They say, but of course now after we've matched the people who listed each other first, there are still going to be lots of unmatched people. We have to figure out who to match next. And they said, well, we'll try to be nice to students. We'll look at the student first choice ranking, and we'll see which residency program might have ranked him second. So we'll look for 2-1 rankings, and if we find one, so if I'm a medical student who didn't get matched to my, who wasn't matched in a 1-1 ranking, my first choice didn't rank me as their first choice. Maybe they ranked me as their second choice, and I could still get matched to them. And if that still doesn't happen, if I'm still left, then we'll look at the places that ranked me first and that I ranked second, and so forth. They just, we're going to go through until we get as many people matched as we can in this process. So this sounds sort of beneficent. That is, it's meant to make good matches, but it wasn't safe to confide to the clearinghouse your true preferences. It puts you at risk. And the way to think about the risk is what happens if you're in this algorithm? What happens if your first choice doesn't love you? So there's some place I would like to go to you as my first choice, but you didn't like me. So you don't rank me very high. I'm not going to match to you. So what happens to me then? Especially what happens to me is, it's not that, you didn't love me when you interviewed me, but it's not that I'm not lovable. My second choice liked me a lot. I'm their first choice. So what you'd like to happen is I don't go to my first choice, you didn't like me, but I go to my second choice, they like me. But that's not what's going to happen in this algorithm, because I don't match to you. I'm not a 1-1 ranking, and you didn't even rank me second, so I don't go to you. So now there's a chance that I could go to my second choice, which ranked me first. But these guys may have already filled all their positions with their second choices. They may no longer have any positions left because they first got some of their first choices, and then they filled up the rest of their positions with the second choices, and when I get to them, they're done. Okay, they have no more spaces. So it turns out that's not such an unusual thing to happen. As we gain experience with this algorithm, what I have to do is not think, what's my first choice? I have to think, what's the best residency program I could get if I claim that it's my first choice? And that's a very different problem. And in particular, of course, if they filled a lot of their positions with their second choice, and I now call them up and I say, what's happening? I thought you guys loved me. And they say, absolutely, you were our first choice. It's also possible that in the course of time, we'll find that I end up there and someone else who they were supposed to match to doesn't get hired there. So this was a problematic algorithm. It's not the one that was used throughout the long successful period. So let's think about what properties an algorithm should have to make it successful, and let me propose a very simple mathematical idea. I'll say that a matching is stable if there isn't a doctor in a residency program not matched to each other who would both prefer to be. Okay, so what's going to make something unstable is me and my second choice, which ranked me first. I would like to work for them. They would like to have me work for them rather than their second choice is who they got. Okay, so when you look at a variety of matching programs, a lot of these are from the British National Health Service, formulated in the 1960s and 70s in the same way that the American programs were formulated in the 1950s. What you see is if they produce stable matchings, they're more likely to still be in use. But it's a small data set, and we supplement data sets like this with experiments. One of the things we have over in the economics department is an experimental laboratory where we can have people go through different kinds of marketplaces. So there's a lot of reason to believe that stability is very important for matching. So let me tell you how you get a stable matching. What's the magic that you do if there were no complications, if everybody was simple and just wanted one job, and if every residency program knew how many positions it had and didn't have to worry about what to do if they didn't fill all of them and things like that. So I'm stepping way back from the details of the actual match. But here's what you do with the rank order list if you want to get a stable match. I'm going to tell you how the algorithm works as if people were doing things, but all that people are doing in this is they're submitting rank order lists. So this is the moment after the interviews when the residents are asked, what are your rank order lists? And they submit them, and now the computer operates as follows. It has each applicant apply to his or her top choice program, and each program that has, say, 5 positions holds the top 5 applicants among those that it's willing to hire. There might be some who, after you interviewed them, you didn't like them at all, and rejects all the others. So at the first step, if you're a residency program, you get a bunch of applications, you only have 5 spots, you hold the 5 you like best according to your rank order list, and you reject the rest. You don't accept the ones you're holding, though. This is not an immediate acceptance algorithm, it's a deferred acceptance algorithm. You're holding these applications, you haven't rejected them yet, but you're not going to accept any applications until the end when you see what other applications might have come in. And what other applications come in? Well, any worker who's rejected at any step makes a new application to his or her most preferred acceptable firm that hasn't yet rejected him or her. Okay, so you just keep going down your list. If you're rejected by your 3rd choice, you apply to your 4th choice. If you're rejected by your 4th choice, you apply to your 5th choice. If you have no more choices, if your list only had 5 choices in it, then you are going to be unmatched if you don't get accepted by one of your top 5. And each firm looks at the new applicants and the ones it's already holding, and it simply ranks them according to its rank order list. It doesn't pay attention to when they applied. It just has a rank order list. It puts the 5 it likes best so far at the top, it holds on to those and rejects the rest. So it could be that when I apply initially to my first choice, they don't immediately reject my application. You apply somewhere and your application is rejected. You now apply to my first choice. They like you better than me, and they now reject my application and hold yours. But when that process has reached its conclusion, now every residency program accepts the applications that it's holding. And this has the property that it produces a stable match. That is, a student fails to get into a residency program only if it's filled with applicants that the residency program prefers. And that means there are no blocking pairs. There's no doctor and residency program who both like each other better than who they were matched to. So again, how can you see that? Supposing I end up matched to my 3rd choice residency program. So I would rather go to my 2nd choice or my 1st choice. How do I know they wouldn't rather have me? Well, the way I ended up in my 3rd choice program is first I applied to my, the way I ended up in my 3rd choice program is first I applied to my 1st choice, and Irene rejected me when she filled up her positions with people she liked better. Then when I was rejected, I applied to my 2nd choice, and Mark rejected me when he filled up. So I'm now in my 3rd choice. I would rather work for them, but they wouldn't rather hire me. So it's a stable match. And it has the property that it's safe for students to put down their true preferences. And the way you can see that is, remember how it was unsafe in the 1950s algorithm. The reason it wasn't safe to put down your true preferences is if that fellow I told you about had listed his 2nd choice and said it was his 1st choice, he would have gotten it because they would have been a 1-1 match. But he missed the chance to get his 2nd choice, even though he was their 1st choice, because he said something else was his 1st choice. But in the deferred acceptance algorithm, that's never going to happen, because the residency programs don't care when you apply. Whenever you apply, they put you in the position that you belong in their preference list, and they only accept people at the end. So if you're the 1st choice of your 2nd choice program, when you get rejected by your 1st choice and apply to your 2nd choice, you'll rise right to the top of their list and never be rejected, and you'll work for them in the end. So it makes it safe to put down your true preferences, because your chance of getting your second choice, if you get rejected by your first choice, is exactly the same as it would have been if you had listed it as your first choice. Okay, so it turns out they found another way of getting a stable match in the 1950s, but couples were a problem. Let me tell you how they tried to deal with it. This is, the problem of men and women marrying each other in medical school and needing two jobs together is one that has been with the medical community for a long time. In the 1970s, there were about 10% women graduating from American medical schools. And 1970s were a really long time ago, culturally speaking. Let me tell you how the medical schools and the match tried to deal with couples in the 1970s. First, you had to be certified by your dean as a legitimate couple. Okay, so, the dean had to think you were a couple. So it meant married, one man, one woman. Then you had to specify one member of the couple as the leading member. Okay, then they didn't actually change any of the software. So you specified one member of the couple as a leading member, and both members of the couple then submitted a rank order list that looked as if you were single. So if I'm in a couple, my rank order list says my first choice, my second choice, my third choice, and my spouse's, my wife's rank order list says her first choice, second choice, third choice. And of course we could talk about these together, but we couldn't coordinate them in any way. And so they coordinated them for us as follows. They would have the leading member go through the match as if single and hopefully get a job in some city. And then the other member had his or her rank order list edited to remove every place that wasn't in the same city. So if I went through the residency match in the 1970s as a member of a couple, as the leading member of a couple, and got a job in Boston, then my wife's preference list would be edited to take out all the places that weren't in Boston. Then she'd go through the match, and often we would get two jobs in Boston. But it turned out we often didn't show up in those jobs in July. We showed up in other jobs. We'd get on the phone and find jobs we liked better, and they would hire us, and then they wouldn't hire some of you, so there would be a rippling effect going through the match. So why is this happening? Well, think about stability and think about what couples want. This didn't work well for couples because of the iron law of marriage, which says that you can't be happier than your spouse. So think about us in Boston. We get two jobs in Boston, but what we wanted was two great jobs in Boston. And instead what we got was a great job and a mediocre job. So we're not happy. Our second choice, if we couldn't get two great jobs in Boston, was to get two great jobs in New York. And if we couldn't do that, two great jobs in California. And so we get the great job and the medium job, and we get on the phone and we try getting two jobs in New York or two jobs in California, and sometimes we succeed. And when we get those jobs, instead, those residency programs had already been matched. They have to call up someone they were matched to and say, oh, so sorry, we're not going to be able to send you a contract. We lost a position. So there was a ripple effect. Now, the quick answer to this is you're trying to get something that's stable, that doesn't have blocking pairs, but couples provide new kinds of blocking pairs. They're a little more complicated than individuals. But you can't possibly give couples what they want if you don't ask them. And what couples are going to consume are pairs of jobs. Notice, very rarely will they both get jobs in the same program. They may have different specialties. But they need two jobs. And if you don't ask them what they want, you can't possibly give them what you want. So the first step toward reform is to ask them what they want and say, as a couple, you can submit a rank order list that says our first choice is these two jobs, second choice these two, third choice these two. That way, if you don't give them, if you have a chance of giving them what they want. Okay? It turns out it's not so easy because unlike the case without couples, stable matchings may not exist. There's all sorts of interesting mathematics having to do with that. It turns out they almost always exist. So there's now when you go through the match, here's the 2018 schedule. The first thing is in a decentralized way, students apply to residency programs and go on interviews. And that's very different than economics. In economics, we have very centralized interviews, and then you go out and give what we call flyouts, and you get offers in a decentralized way. But in medicine, you have these decentralized interviews. You sometimes go on a lot of interviews. I'll talk about that briefly. And then single students fill out rank order lists of programs, and couples fill out rank order lists of programs, of pairs of programs. Right? So we at least have a chance of giving couples what they want. Now then, not everyone is matched, and there's a very poorly designed scramble, which I was not involved in any way. And then there's match. Okay? So growing number of couples, about 1,100 couples went through the match last year. So that's 2,200 people went through as couples out of about 17,000 graduates of American medical schools, so a not insignificant number. The algorithm is a little complex, but just to say something about it is the left-hand side is really like the algorithm I showed you, the simple one. And the right-hand side is about fixing problems related to couples and to some other things too. Some people need preliminary positions as well as categorical positions. Some programs, if they don't fill their positions, need to have them reassigned. So there are a bunch of complications. These are widely used now in medicine, not just in the residency match, but in fellowship matches. There are constantly new matches being formed because unraveling hasn't gone away. So when we think about current issues in the resident match, one of the things to have at the front of our minds is we don't want to reignite unraveling. These are, because of the intense competition, because there's a fixed pool of medical graduates who are all applying for residencies or surgical fellows all applying for pediatric surgery fellowships. There's a lot of competition in a way that is fiercer in some ways than in many labor markets, because also you can't overfill your positions. You can't make 12 offers for 10 positions because of your accreditation and things like that. So when you're trying to fix problems with the match, you have to keep in mind you don't want to cause more unraveling. There's now a lot of interviews. So in the residency front, someone wrote an article called Residency Placement Fever. We're seeing something similar in college admissions with a common app. If you have kids of college age, it's now easy to apply to lots of colleges. And with the electronic residency application system, it's now easier than it used to be to apply to residency programs. So computers are changing our markets in a bunch of ways. Many of them are very, very good ways. It makes the process of making offers and processing them much faster, but it also makes it easier and cheaper to make lots of applications. And that is causing some issues of expense and of time. So again, as I say, what we do as economists is we have an annual meeting where the whole profession comes, and that's where we do our initial interviews, and then we invite people out for subsequent interviews. So the initial interviewing in economics is more centralized than in medicine, although the subsequent offering process is less centralized. We also have a signaling process in economics where there's still some congestion in interviews. Departments get hundreds of applications for new assistant professors, can only interview 20 or 30 of them at the meetings, and then 8 of them on campus in flyouts. And we have a signaling system where people can send signals through the American Economic Association to indicate particular interest that helps sort that process out a little bit. And lately, with Mark and Irene and other people, we've been talking about whether it might even make sense to think about scheduling interviews through some kind of match. With some kind of capacity restriction on or guidance on what residency programs and fellowships, how many interviews they should conduct per position they're seeking to fill. Because it seems right now that as the market has matured, instead of going earlier and earlier as they used to, people are interviewing more and more. And it's not clear that, it seems possible that there could be some welfare improvements by cutting down on interviews that don't actually lead to matches. So again, just about unraveling, I should just close by saying that unraveling, the problem that led to the match, is still a very real problem in private equity, in college sports. When I meet Stanford athletes, one thing I like to ask them is, how old were they when they first met a Stanford coach? Some of them were very young. College admissions in general, these are unraveled markets. Medical labor markets used to be unraveled. In fixing its current problems, you want to be sure not to get back to the old problems. Okay. Okay, let me switch gears and talk about surgery. And you know, I'm just an economist. So a different kind of matching market that I was asked to also talk about today is kidney exchange. And of course, you can't buy and sell kidneys, but they're in real short supply. There are about 100,000 people waiting on the deceased donor list for kidneys this morning. In 2017, we only did 14,000 deceased donor transplants, so the wait is long. Thousands of people die while waiting. Thousands more are taken off the waiting list when they become too ill to transplant. So waiting for a transplant is a long, difficult process. But of course, kidneys are a little bit special because you can do live donation with kidneys. And where the economists come in is not everyone who's healthy enough to be a living donor can actually give to the patient he loves. And so one way of making transplants accessible to more people is to think about kidney exchange, paired donation, it's sometimes called. Mark, of course, is deeply involved in this, and I get to talk to him about that sometime. But I could have made him the poster boy for the previous part of the talk too, since he's also a residency director. Okay, so a really simple kidney exchange is between two pairs, and you can see that donor one loves recipient one but has a different blood type. That's going to make it difficult to make a transplant there. And here is the reverse. But there's an A kidney for the patient who needs it and a B kidney for the patient who needs it. So if we could arrange an exchange, both patients could get a compatible kidney, and we'd have two transplants that we might not otherwise have gotten, and certainly without having to do desensitization. Notice that no money changes hands. The National Organ Transplant Act says it's illegal to pay for a kidney. It actually says something a little more complicated than that got interesting when we started to talk to the Justice Department about it. It says it's unlawful to transfer any human organ for valuable consideration. So this might look like valuable consideration to those of you who took a law course once. Consideration is contract language. A kidney is being exchanged. Kidneys are pretty valuable. Congress cut the Gordian knot by amending the National Organ Transplant Act to say the preceding sentence, the one in red, does not apply with respect to human organ paired donation. And paired donation came in as a term of art for kidney exchange that doesn't use the word exchange, so it doesn't sound like there's valuable consideration. So we've been doing kidney exchange in the U.S. since about 2000, but this law was passed in 2007. Kidney exchange is fully legal in the United States. Now, I've spent a lot of time, I'm not going to talk about today, but I've spent a lot of time studying repugnant transactions. And I'll say a transaction is repugnant if some people want to engage in it and others don't think they should be allowed to. So buying and selling kidneys is a repugnant transaction in this way. And it's repugnant just about everywhere in the world. There actually is one country in the world where there's a legal cash market, and that's the Islamic Republic of Iran. But there are lots of black markets. And just as other kinds of repugnant transactions, sometimes when we make laws against things, we end up inadvertently designing black markets. But kidney exchange is a way of acting within the law and taking that repugnance very seriously. No money changes hands, and Congress says that it's not valuable consideration. Incidentally, the Norwood Act, it took 3 Congresses to pass it, but it passed without dissent. So the same legislative body that says you can't buy and sell a kidney had no trouble saying you can do kidney exchange. Right? There wasn't a single dissent. So there's congestion. Remember I told you about markets, they have to be thick. So making kidney exchange thick involved getting databases of patient donor pairs who could be compared for compatibility. It took a while when we started this in the early 2000s to get patients and donors reconsented so that their medical data could be used to see not just if they could be matched to the person they loved, but to other people. So here's a 2006 exchange that I was a witness to. I hadn't scrubbed in, so I'm keeping my hands to myself so no one hands me anything. This is in Cincinnati, Ohio. This gentleman is Steve Woodall. Here's the kidney. Steps behind me, not here, but steps behind me in this picture is the other operating room where the nephrectomy was performed. And at the same time, the other half of the exchange was going on in Toledo, Ohio, where Mike Reese, who with whom I've done a lot of work, is, and when I say at the same time, what I mean is after the patients were anesthetized and initial incisions were made, Steve got on his cell phone and called Mike and said, we're ready in Cincinnati, are you ready in Toledo? And when he was told they were, the operation went ahead, and this kidney is transplanted into this guy. And at the same time, the other patient and the other donor are having the same operations in Toledo. And the reason they do it at the same time is you can't give valuable consideration for an organ. So you can't write a contract that says, we'll give you a kidney today and you give us one tomorrow. That's not a legal contract in the United States. And so when you do these simple exchanges, you do them at the same time to make sure everything goes through. But that means it's hard to do very big exchanges, because even this simple exchange between two pairs needs 4 simultaneous operating rooms, 4 simultaneous surgical teams ready. So it's a logistical job. Now, that turns out to be simpler when you have non-directed donors. Non-directed donors want to give a kidney but don't have a particular patient in mind. They have to go through lots of screens, all the usual screens and other psychological screens. And what used to happen before kidney exchange was if you qualified as a non-directed donor, you were offered the opportunity to give to someone on the waiting list for a deceased donor organ. But now that there was this thick market for kidney exchange, you could offer a more enticing opportunity to non-directed donors. You could give to a recipient in a patient-donor pair that's waiting for exchange, and they could pass it forward, and you could spark several transplants. So here's also in 2006, the picture was taken in 2007. Here's a picture of such a chain. And the question is, why are there only 6 people in the picture? And the reason is, in 2006, we were doing these simultaneously, and 6 operating rooms and surgical teams were all we could reliably put together at the same time. But when you have a non-directed donor, you can start to ask, do we have to do all those exchanges simultaneously? And remember, the reason why that picture I showed you in Cincinnati was part of a simultaneous exchange was because if we have an exchange between 2 couples and we don't do it simultaneously, there's a chance of something going very badly wrong. And that's something, supposing this was done non-simultaneously, and on day 1, donor 2 successfully gives a kidney to recipient 1. And on day 2, for whatever reason, donor 1 fails to give a kidney to recipient 2. Pair 2 has been really harmed. This was a very bad event for them because they had a surgery that didn't help them, and they no longer have a kidney to take part in the next kidney exchange. So that's why those are always done simultaneously, or virtually always done simultaneously. But if you have a non-directed donor, a broken link is disappointing but not tragic, because supposing this non-directed donor comes along and on day 1 gives to recipient 1, and on day 2, for whatever reason, donor 1 fails to give to recipient 2. That's very disappointing, but pair 2 was going to get a kidney before they received one, so they can still take part in the next kidney exchange. Right? They haven't had a surgery that didn't help them. They're still in business. So the cost of that broken link is much less, and we can start to explore the possibility that maybe that cost is small enough that it'll be a good idea to do non-directed donor chains non-simultaneously. So we wrote about this at some point. And the first person to organized one was Mike Reese. This is one of these papers with surgeons and economists and other people. And when the first chain was reported, it had 20 people in the picture. Okay, this is the picture from New England Journal of Medicine. This is the picture, I think, from People magazine. So these people came out from behind their HIPAA protection, and I can tell you their names. The last lady in the chain was blood type AB. That was sort of a mistake. But today, if we had a blood type AB donor at the end of a chain, we'd encourage her to immediately give to someone on the deceased donor list. Because it turns out it's hard to find a good match in the kidney exchange pool for an AB donor, because many AB patients are compatible with their intended donors. So it actually took 3 years before a match was found for her, and she was still game, Helena McKinney, and 12 more people were added to the picture. So chains can be long sometimes. And the reason chains can be long is there are a lot of highly sensitized patients in American kidney exchange. So you all know better than I that there are a lot of barriers other than blood type barriers that stop someone from taking someone else's kidneys. And in particular, there are immunological barriers. Every donor is a vector of human leukocyte antigens, and sometimes recipients have preformed antibodies against some of those antigens. They could have gotten these in childbirth. They could have gotten them from blood transfusions. They could have gotten these from previous kidney transplant. And the more of these you have, the harder it is for you to find a match. So here's a picture of a compatibility graph, a snapshot from one of the kidney exchanges, the Alliance for Paired Donation, at a moment in time. And each circle, it represents a patient-donor pair. And each arrow, an arrow goes from one pair to another, if the kidney can go from the donor in the first pair to the patient in the second pair. And everybody in this picture, all the patients and all the donors, have blood type A. So there are no blood type incompatibilities. But still, what you see is there's only a small number of pairs that are not highly sensitized, that are easy to match, that can take lots of kidneys. And the rest are hard to match. So how do we get long chains? Why are long chains important? Supposing we're a room full of hard to match pairs. So I'm part of a pair. The chance that we can give one of you a kidney is very small because you guys are all hard to match. You're all highly sensitized, so you probably can't take our kidney. But in a big room like this, one of you can take our kidney. That's great. The chance that you can give a kidney back to us is very small because we're highly sensitized. But the chance that you can give a kidney to someone else in the room, because it's a big room, that's not so small. And the chance that they can give a kidney to someone else in the room and they can give a kidney to someone else. So that's how chains get formed. And you can do these chains non-simultaneously if you start with a non-directed donor. The mathematics is a little complex. Here's a picture from PNAS. One of the interesting things about sometimes publishing in medical journals, if you're an economist, is when you look at this, you're going to think that I must be the senior author. But economists, we publish in alphabetical order. So it's a different style of scientific communication. But anyway, you have to do some fancy mathematics, but you can do it to find sometimes long chains. Here's a chain, Mark does a lot of his work with the National Kidney Registry. Here's a chain that in 2012 was the longest of its kind. It has 60 people in it. It's no longer the longest. I think the average American chain at some point had 4 or 5 transplants in it, so 8 to 10 people in the picture. And we do a lot of the transplants we do with the couple of hundred non-directed donors. They're very important each year. So if I stopped here, I would be telling you about victory after victory. Kidney exchange has grown. Last year was sort of 12 to 15% of the living donor transplants in the United States, depending how you count the non-directed donors. But there's 100,000 people on the waiting list, so these are victories in a battle that we're losing. And around the world, end-stage renal disease is a big killer. Poor countries are becoming middle class. They're not just having infectious diseases and acute diseases, they're having chronic diseases. So kidney disease is a big disease around the world. For lots of people, it's a death sentence because, of course, it's expensive to treat kidney disease, and if you live in a poor country, they may not have renal replacement therapies available. So here's a picture of transplantation around the world. Blue is per million deceased donors, per million population. Orange, or whatever color that is living donors. In the West, we do pretty well. In poorer places, the technology may exist. You can get a transplant at one of the smaller number of excellent hospitals in the Philippines, but they don't do many, partly because the Philippine National Health Insurance doesn't cover it. So there are people who could get transplants in the Philippines if they could afford it, but there's a financial barrier there. So the question is, could we expand American kidney exchange to invite in foreign patient-donor pairs? And Mike Reese has been the pioneer in this. The first pair of this kind was done in January 2015. Here's what the pair looked like when it was published just recently, just last year. Jose got a kidney from an American non-directed donor, and his wife, who was blood type O, continued a chain. At the time the paper was published, this had 22 people in the picture, 23 people counting the non-directed donor. Okay, so a big chain. And the question is why is this affordable? The reason it's affordable is the reason it's potentially affordable, there's lots of things that still have to be worked out, is every time you transplant an American, you save some part of the American healthcare system a lot of money because dialysis is much more expensive than transplantation. So if you have a hard-to-match American patient who is going to spend a long time on dialysis, you can generate enough money to pay for the foreign surgeries and send them home for care at the good hospitals in the Philippines from the savings. So just, well, let me not spend much time on this, but dialysis year after year is a big deal. End-stage renal disease is 7% of the Medicare budget. Okay, so it's a giant thing. It's about $50 billion a year. Medicare pays the bulk of that, but if you, God forbid, needed, had ESRD, you have good private insurance, they would be responsible for you for the first 33 months, and they pay about, easily twice what Medicare pays. So there's money to be saved both by private insurers and by Medicare when you transplant hard-to-match Americans. So global kidney exchange is actually a special opportunity for mutual benefit between overseas patients from poorer countries and American patients. Mostly we can't, when we think of the things that USAID supports, how we do medical foreign aid, mostly we can't do very expensive things, and those wouldn't be cost effective. But kidney exchange is special because if you're in a rich country, it doesn't have to be the US, it could be in Western Europe as well. If you're a rich country doing kidney exchange with lots of hard-to-match pairs and expensive dialysis, then you can invite in foreign pairs for free. Now, it's not so easy. The medical logistics isn't so hard. The new costs are in surgeries, and the savings are on dialysis. And in the US medical system, those occur in different places. So the question is, what will be the bridge? It might be self-insuring companies. But there's also a chance that, say, Italy would be a good place to start this because of a single-payer healthcare system, so the savings come out of the same pocket as the new expenses. There's been some pushback on this out of the fear that it's like black markets in kidneys. Actually visited a black market in kidneys in Baku in Azerbaijan. But that's a story for another time. So as a first reaction, I think some of the pushback we get has to do with the feeling that maybe this is like a black market. So here's another paper with surgeons and economists in it that was published in March in the American Journal of Transplantation, and it's about overcoming financial barriers through global kidney exchange. The journal published it and also at the same time published an editorial saying that maybe it wasn't such a good idea. So the paper and the editorial came out, and the following October there was a lot of the issue was devoted to back and forth about whether this was a good idea or not. And my old buddy Frank Delmonico wrote a letter called Opposition to Irresponsible Global Kidney Exchange, in which he said that these poor countries were so corrupted by black markets that we couldn't possibly know that Jose and Christine were really a husband and wife. They could be a buyer and a seller. And our foreign surgical colleagues are appalled by this. They say, we know very well who's married to who in Mexico or in the Philippines. So they think of this as an anti-immigration kind of comment, and we wrote a reply of that sort. People shouldn't be banned just because of their country of origin. So there are concerns. There are things to think about here. We've also gotten some support for this. The American Society of Transplant Surgeons endorsed us. Italy, we have colleagues in Italy who would like to do this, and they've recommended to the World Health Organization that the World Health Organization should sponsor and supervise this. But there's a lot of opposition as well, so it's not clear to me that this will be a successful thing. But I have some hope, because in the places where we've done this, here's a chain that involves a lady named Marisol Robles and her physicians. It's been very well received. So here's the front page of Newsweek on Espanol that was shortly after her transplant, and the cover story says transplants of kidneys between the US and Mexico, a bridge of life. And the first paragraph says, just as US President Donald Trump is seeking to build a wall of thousands of miles on the border with Mexico, a tireless surgeon and economist joined forces to exchange organs between citizens of both countries. So they think it's a good idea. I'm hopeful that we can extend kidney exchange to help relieve the serious burden of kidney disease around the world. Thank you.